What if I told you that a Japanese immigrant opened a restaurant in Seattle in 1976 with 30 seats and 5 menu items and created a food category that now feeds millions of people daily? That a scientist crossed two red cherries in 1952 and produced a yellow one that became the most expensive cherry in America? That Seattle invented the modern specialty coffee movement not when Starbucks opened, but 2 decades earlier, in a Pike Place market shop that Starbucks founder Howard Schultz visited in 1983 and decided to copy? Washington State. The Evergreen State. The northwest corner of the continental United States. 10 dishes this state doesn't just make. It owns. Teriyaki is a Japanese word. Seattle teriyaki is not a Japanese dish. On March 2, 1976, Toshihiro Kasahara opened Toshi's Teriyaki restaurant at 372 Roy Street in the Lower Queen Anne neighborhood of Seattle. He had emigrated from Ashikaga City, Japan, in 1967, studied business at Portland State University, and spent years working in restaurant kitchens before landing in Seattle. He had 30 seats and 5 items on the menu. What Kasahara made was not traditional Japanese teriyaki. Traditional Japanese teriyaki is a cooking technique, proteins glazed with soy sauce, sake, mirin, and sugar, then grilled with restraint. Kasahara's version was louder, sweeter, more generous. He used sugar instead of sweet rice wine. He marinated chicken thighs for hours until they absorbed the sauce completely. He grilled them over open flame until caramelized at the edges and served them sliced over a molded mound of white rice with a cabbage salad dressed in sesame oil and rice wine vinegar. For a couple of dollars. Locals flocked immediately. Within years, teriyaki shops were multiplying across Seattle. By the mid-1990s, there were over 175 teriyaki restaurants in the city. The New York Times wrote in 2010 that teriyaki was the closest this city comes to a Chicago dog. Korean immigrants arrived in Seattle in the 1980s and 1990s and opened their own teriyaki shops, faster cooking methods, slightly different preparation, and drove the phenomenon to its current scale. Seattle-style teriyaki is now found in every American city. It is recognizable by its white takeout containers, its sweet thick sauce, its chicken thighs over rice. It is the legacy of a 30-seat restaurant on Roy Street opened by a man from Ashikaga City who thought Seattle needed something different. He was right. In 1952, a plant scientist named Harold Fogel was working at Washington State University's research station in Prosser, in the Yakima Valley. He was trying to extend the cherry season. He crossed a Bing cherry with a Van cherry, 2 dark red varieties, and watched what grew. What grew was yellow, with a red blush. Sweet to a degree that the Bing was not. The flesh was creamy and firm with notes of peach and caramel. The sugar content reached 17 to 23%, nearly 1/5 sugar by weight. Fogel called it P1-680. In 1960, it was released publicly under the name Rainier, after Mount Rainier, the volcanic peak that dominates the western Washington skyline. I was just as surprised as anyone that white ones showed up, Fogel told the Seattle Times in 2004. He had not been trying to make a yellow cherry. The recessive gene appeared on its own. The result was one of the most expensive cherries in the world. Rainier cherries are difficult to grow. Their skin is thin. A summer rainstorm can split it. Birds target them before pickers can reach them. Birds prefer sweet fruit, and Rainiers are the sweetest fruit on the tree. Growers pay their best pickers higher rates to go slowly and lay the fruit, not drop it, into the bucket. The season lasts 6 to 7 weeks. When it ends, Rainier cherries disappear from markets until the following June. The mother tree that produced the first Rainier cherries still grows on an orchard 5 miles from the Prosser Research Station. It is over 70 years old. It still fruits. Washington State produces more apples than any other state in the country. It is not close. Washington accounts for roughly 60% of all apples grown commercially in the United States. The Wenatchee Valley, the Yakima Valley, and the Columbia Basin produce the conditions. Warm, dry days, cold nights, volcanic soil, irrigation from snowmelt, that create the density of flavor and the crispness of texture that make Washington apples the benchmark for the industry. The apple culture of Washington began in 1826, when Hudson's Bay Company planted the first orchard at Fort Vancouver, on the Columbia River near present-day Portland. In 1847, an Iowa nurseryman named Henderson Llewellyn drove an ox cart across the Oregon Trail carrying 700 grafted fruit trees, including apples, and planted the first commercial orchard in the Pacific Northwest. Washington's apple industry grew slowly through the 19th century and exploded after irrigation projects opened the desert valleys of eastern Washington to farming in the early 20th century. The Honeycrisp, now the most popular apple in America, was developed at the University of Minnesota, not Washington. But Washington is where it is grown at the highest quality and in the greatest volume. The Cosmic Crisp, developed over 20 years at Washington State University and released in 2019, is the first apple variety trademarked by a state university and is available only from Washington growers. It has a shelf life of up to a year. It was grown from 2 million trees in its first commercial harvest. It's sold out. Washington apple growers produce between 10 and 12 billion apples per year. The Dungeness crab is named after the town of Dungeness on the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, a community of under 1,000 people on a spit of land that juts into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The crab was first commercially harvested there in the 1800s and has carried the name of that small Washington town ever since, regardless of where along the Pacific coast it is caught. Dungeness crab ranges from Alaska to Central California. Washington's commercial harvest focuses on Puget Sound and the coast. The crab is larger than most Atlantic crab species. A mature Dungeness can weigh 4 to 5 pounds, with sweet, delicate, slightly briny meat that needs almost nothing done to it. Steam it, crack it, dip it in butter, eat it. The Washington seafood tradition around Dungeness is communal and seasonal. The crab season opens in December and runs through July, though the peak harvest is winter. Crab feeds, tables covered in newspaper, pots of steaming crab, drawn butter, sourdough bread, are the Northwest equivalent of the Maryland crab feast or the Louisiana crawfish boil. The same logic. One animal, one table, everybody's hands. Dungeness crab is now farmed and shipped nationally. The version eaten on a dock in Westport, Washington, on a cold December morning, an hour after the boat came in, cannot be replicated by the crab shipped to a restaurant in Denver. The difference is time and temperature. This is the hot dog that visitors photograph before they eat it, and then eat quietly, and then order another. A Seattle dog is an all-beef hot dog served in a grilled split bun, topped with a thick layer of cream cheese, softened, sometimes flavored, and finished with grilled onions, jalapenos, or sauerkraut. The cream cheese is not optional. It is the defining feature. It is what makes the Seattle dog a Seattle dog rather than a hot dog from anywhere else. The Seattle dog emerged from the street food scene around Pike Place Market and Pioneer Square in the 1980s and 1990s, sold from carts outside bars and music venues at late-night hours. The cream cheese theory most commonly told is that a hot dog vendor ran out of condiments one night and used the cream cheese from a nearby bagel shop. A second theory credits the large Taiwanese and Japanese immigrant communities of Seattle, where cream cheese was a common ingredient in various preparations. A third theory simply says it tasted good, and that was sufficient reason. The Seattle dog is now a fixture at Mariners and Seahawks games, at the stadiums along the waterfront. Hot dog carts throughout the city list it as the first and primary option. Visitors from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles try it with significant skepticism. Then they eat it. The cream cheese melts into the hot dog. There is an onion grown in Washington state so mild and so sweet that people eat it raw like an apple. This has been documented. It is not a metaphor. The Walla Walla sweet onion was brought to Washington's Walla Walla Valley by a French soldier named Peter Peary, who arrived on the island of Corsica around 1900 and brought onion seeds with him. The seeds were adapted over generations of selective cultivation to the specific conditions of the Walla Walla Valley. Warm summers, mild winters, volcanic soil with low sulfur content that remove the pungency from the onion and leave only sweetness. Walla Walla sweet onions have a water content of over 90% and a sugar content significantly higher than standard onions. The low sulfur in the Walla Walla Valley soil is the key. Sulfur compounds in onions are what cause eyes to tear and what give raw onion its bite. Without the sulfur, the onion is sweet enough to eat without preparation. In 1995, the Walla Walla sweet onion received a federal marketing order designating it as a product that can only be grown in a specific region of Washington and Oregon, essentially a geographic protection similar to Champagne or Parmigiano Reggiano. The season runs from June through August. During that window, Walla Walla sweet onions appear at farm stands, farmers markets, and roadside sellers across the state. Palouse country, the rolling hills of southeastern Washington and northern Idaho, produces approximately one-third of the total lentil supply of the United States. The Palouse is one of the most productive dryland farming regions in the world, where the combination of volcanic ash soil, moderate rainfall, and cold winters creates conditions ideal for pulse crops. Lentils arrived in the Palouse in the early 20th century, introduced by farmers looking for a rotation crop that would fix nitrogen in the soil while producing a marketable product. The French green lentil, the red lentil, and the black beluga lentil all grow in the Palouse. The Palouse brand has become a recognized mark of quality for pulse crops in national and international markets. Washington lentils do not have the cultural identity of the Rainier cherry or the Seattle teriyaki. They are not a dish. They are an ingredient, one that feeds the country's growing appetite for plant-based protein, that appears in soups and salads and grain bowls across America without the eater knowing where the lentil was grown. The Palouse knows. The geoduck is the largest burrowing clam in the world. It can weigh up to 15 pounds. Its siphon, the long neck that extends from the shell, can reach 3 feet in length. It lives buried 2 to 3 feet beneath the tidal mudflats of Puget Sound and Hood Canal, where it feeds by filtering seawater. It can live for more than 150 years. The name is pronounced gooey duck. It is a Lushootseed word from the indigenous peoples of the Puget Sound region, meaning roughly dig deep. The indigenous peoples of Washington had been harvesting geoduck for thousands of years before European contact. The commercial geoduck fishery in Washington developed in the 1970s when the enormous size and unusual appearance of the clam attracted attention from Asian seafood markets. Today, Washington state produces approximately 90% of the world's commercial geoduck supply. The overwhelming majority, over 70%, is exported directly to China, Japan, and South Korea, where geoduck is considered a luxury ingredient, valued for its sweet, oceanic flavor and its crunchy, unique texture. In Seattle's Asian-influenced restaurants, geoduck appears as sashimi, in hot pot, and in preparations that highlight its raw crunch. A single geoduck can retail for $30 to $60 or more. The geoduck is the most valuable wild shellfish harvest in Washington by dollar value per pound. In 1920, 2 Armenian immigrants named Mark Balaban and Armen Tertsagian arrived in the Wenatchee Valley of Washington state and started a fruit farm. They grew apples and apricots. They had more apples than they could sell. In Armenia, there is a confection called Turkish Delight, a gelatin-based candy flavored with fruit and dusted with powdered sugar. Balaban and Tertsagian knew the recipe from home. They adapted it using their surplus Washington apples, coating the gelatin candy with walnuts and powdered sugar. They called the apple version Applets and the apricot version cotlets. They began selling them in 1920 from their farm. Applets and cotlets became one of Washington state's most recognizable regional foods. Liberty Orchards, the company the 2 men founded, sold the candy through department stores and mail-order catalogs across the country for decades. They were given as gifts. They were shipped to service members overseas. They became a fixture at every Washington state tourist stop, every gift shop, every rest area on Interstate 90. The Kashmir, Washington factory became a tourist destination. Visitors could watch the candy being made. The town of Kashmir built its identity in part around the Applets and Cotlets factory. Washington state does not have a single famous dish. It has a landscape. The Cascade Range divides the state into 2 completely different food worlds. West of the mountains, rain, seafood, coffee, teriyaki, the urban food culture of Seattle. East of the mountains, dry heat, volcanic soil, irrigated valleys, apples and cherries and lentils and onions and wine grapes. One of the most productive agricultural regions in the Western Hemisphere. The teriyaki that Toshihiro Kasahara made in a 30-seat Lower Queen Anne restaurant in 1976 is now eaten in every city in America. The cherry that Harold Fogel grew by accident in a research station in 1952 is still the most expensive cherry in American markets 70 years later. The onion that a Corsican soldier brought to Walla Walla around 1900 is now protected by federal designation as a product specific to its valley. The geoduck that indigenous peoples harvested from Puget Sound mudflats for thousands of years now feeds luxury restaurants in Shanghai and Tokyo. Not every state has a hot dog that requires cream cheese and somehow works. Not every state has a clam that can live for 150 years and sells for $60 a pound. Not every state's most significant agricultural contribution, the apple, comes from a desert made productive by snowmelt and volcanic ash and generations of farming knowledge. Washington state does things its own way. Has since the Hudson's Bay Company planted the first orchard at Fort Vancouver in 1826, and the land decided it was very good at growing things,